Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show. Having completed our trilogy on the future of Ireland and Europe, we now turn our sights on the two other Celtic nations in these islands, Scotland and Wales. In the last half-century, Scottish politics has been transformed, starting with the victory of that very special lady, Winifred Margaret Ewing, in a by-election in Hamilton in 1967. From having no parliament and little distinctive Scottish voice in the United Kingdom, Scotland has moved democratically to the very brink of independence. Alex's special guest this week has been active in politics throughout that period, and not from only one vantage point, but from that of three different political parties. Now an SNP member of the Scottish Parliament, Alex's interview with Alex Neill demonstrates that he's lost none of his ability to rebel from the party line as he charts the way forward for Scotland. But first, let's have a look at your tweets, your messages, and your emails. Gilly says, Alex Salmond Show with political perspectives is very important in order to analyse in a critical way very serious issues. We then heard from Harry Harper, who says, watch my first show this week and I'm not likely to miss one in the future. Pleased to hear it, Harry. Then a couple of emails, first from David Sharp, who says, I love the show, Alex. It's good that you've got a good diversity of people who appear. All the best. And finally from Ian Bruce, hi Alex, I'm really enjoying the show. How about an interview with David Heyman? Apart from being a great actor, he's been an avid supporter of independence for many years and is also the founder of Spirit Aid, which, as you know, is a well-run charity doing good work in Scotland and across the globe. Keep up the good work. Well, Ian, I'm delighted to say that very soon Alex will be interviewing David Heyman on this show. Now, the powers of the Scottish Parliament are still in the news. These are the scenes from just 2 weeks ago when campaigners rallied to protect their 20-year-old institution from a Brexit-inspired power grab by Westminster. But this is a story which, in terms of major political developments, stretches back half a century. Closely involved for all of that period, even longer than Alex Salmond himself, has been Alex Neill, one-time key member of Scottish Labour, sometime breakaway party organiser, Scottish Government Secretary, and now SNP backbencher in the Scottish Parliament. Alex caught up with him in Scotland's capital city of Edinburgh.
Alex Neill, member of the Scottish Parliament, former government minister in Scotland. You cut your political teeth in Ayrshire, one of the hotbeds of socialism in Scotland, and originally a member of the Labour Party. So growing up in that tradition, you came to prominence pretty early. You may even have had a hand in writing a Labour Party manifesto way back then.
Well, 1966 was the first election I was ever involved in. I was 14 years of age and I was very inspired by your hero, Harold Wilson, and actually met him for the first time when he came to Ayr in 1966 to address an election rally. And I was also that year the Labour candidate for Dalmellington High School mock election, and I won it outright because I was brought up in a mining community. And if you were interested in politics at all...
Surely Dalmellington High, you wouldn't have too much trouble as a Labour candidate in 1966.
That's why I robbed home, no problem, I couldn't lose. But being brought up in the mining community, if you were interested in politics in those days, then it was the Labour Party. There was no other party you could join. And of course, I joined the Labour Party Young Socialists. I was the chair of the Labour Club at university. I was the first chair of the Scottish and then the National Organisation of Labour Students, then the first research officer for the Labour Party in Scotland.
And this was the first ever full-time research officer of the Labour Party in Scotland.
That's right.
What was it? It was the Scottish Council of the Labour Party.
That's right. It was a kind of very limited devolution, but of course, because of the SNP success in the February 74 election, and subsequently in the October 74 election, the role of my job and the role of the Scottish Labour Party became much more important, and for once, we were listened to in London.
And devolution was forced on the Scottish Labour Party, whether they wanted it or not. The Labour Party were persuaded in Scotland to go for devolution against their will, which is a fascinating irony.
Absolutely.
Held the SNP more or less at bay in October 74. And you were the research officer who had a hand in achieving that result.
Yes.
And in writing the manifesto for the Labour Party, promising a powerhouse parliament.
That's right.
But then within a year or two, that you had decided that that wasn't going to happen and you were off to pastures new. What happened then?
Well, there were two things. First of all, the way in which the Labour Party utterly reneged on its promise to the Scottish people, because the key litmus test of the first white paper on the Scottish Assembly was whether it would have control of the Scottish Development Agency, described in our manifesto as the main agent for the regeneration of the Scottish economy. That was issue number one in Scotland, was the regeneration of the economy. The Assembly wasn't going to get those powers, and that was a major betrayal as far as I was concerned. There were other betrayals, but that was a major one.
And this was the first muted Scottish Assembly, as it was then in modern times, in the 1970s, being considered by the Labour government because of the upsurge in support for the Scottish National
Absolutely, absolutely. And the second issue was just the general, that Wilson government under Healy's chancellorship basically, I think, sold the jerseys on a lot of the promises that had been made.
To the IMF.
To the IMF, and as it turned out, it didn't need to because the figures were false that the Treasury had presented them with, which made it even worse.
It's a habit of the Treasury.
Absolutely, which still goes on today. So that led me, along with Jim Sirrs and John Robertson, the then Labour MP for Paisley, to decide that the time had come to...
So Jim Sirrs was the Labour Party Member of Parliament for South Ayrshire.
That's right.
John Robertson for Paisley, and you were the research officer of the Labour Party. So
right.
you were actually employed by the Labour Party while you were plotting how shall we describe it, a breakaway?
No, I resigned immediately whenever we decided to do it. I resigned within a day or two from the Labour Party because I thought that was a wonderful thing to do. Well, we weren't plotting anything until the white paper came out.
Which was the litmus test, as you
The litmus test, and therefore it was very quick. I mean, we met in Jim's house with Bob Brown, who you knew, who was the PR advisor to the Labour Party in Scotland at the time, very highly respected journalist in Scotland, and we immediately resigned from the Labour Party.
But, well, two things happened. One, there wasn't the general election that you anticipated.
That's right.
And secondly, your party drifted into some turbulent waters.
The problem was twofold. Number one, obviously the Lib Lab Pact came along and therefore there wasn't an election, and by the time the election came, the SNP's own credibility had gone down. We suffered from that. And also the international Marxist group had by then infiltrated the SLP, and basically as an organisation it lost its effectiveness.
So in the 79 election, which of course Margaret Thatcher triumphed in, the Labour Party were defeated. The Assembly legislation, which had gone through the Commons, albeit fairly heavily butchered, and then had a majority vote in favour of it in the 1979 referendum in Scotland, but that was judged not to be a large enough majority because of an amendment put forward by George Cunningham, a Labour MP, but as we have subsequently found out, dreamt up by Robin Cook, a very famous Labour MP. It was a blocking mechanism, and Margaret Thatcher's government decided that they could afford politically to effectively reverse the result of a referendum. Ironic these days, where we're told that 51 or 52% of the referendum is sacrosanct.
Absolutely.
It wasn't so in 1979.
No, it was totally rigged. The rules were rigged. I mean, 40% included people who were dead. Because it was such a high threshold, the way the electoral register was done in those days, that effectively dead people voted against the Assembly. That was the net effect of it.
This is because they were on the register, and in fact the winter of discontent added to that because people hadn't been removed from the register.
Exactly.
And people would be registered twice, there had been an update, there wasn't an update, the postal vote register and so on and so forth. So lots of people who couldn't vote for perfectly legitimate reasons, either because they were registered in the wrong place, didn't get their postal vote, or, as you say, were dead, were effectively counted as being against.
That's right, absolutely. That's right. I mean, these days, if you had an electoral commission in those days, there's no way that would have passed the electoral commission's test of a fair referendum.
Well, hopefully some people would have gone to jail under these circumstances.
Absolutely.
So then, in the aftermath then of the 1979 election, you're basically looking at what resembled a political desert in Scotland. That is to say, the SNP had lost its impetus. They'd been cut back to 2 MPs. Jim Sirrs had lost his seat in South Ayrshire. The SLP was effectively defunct. Margaret Thatcher was into the Commons with a healthy majority, and no sign or progress towards Scottish self-government. So What did Alex Neill do then?
Yeah, it took a wee while before I actually joined a number of years before I joined the SNP, because I actually went through a stage of losing interest in politics, and certainly losing interest in active politics. And also at that time, there were aspects of the SNP that didn't appeal to me. I think it's been transformed, if I may say so, under your own leadership, and therefore it took me longer before I joined. I also had moved job, and it was actually difficult for me job-wise to become a member of the SNP, certainly transparently a member of the SNP, but eventually I did join the SNP.
Not just joined, but by 1989 you'd emerged as an SNP candidate in a by-election in Glasgow.
Right. The Glasgow Central by-election, and that was an experience. I'd never fought an election in Glasgow before.
For an international audience, it should be, although that Glasgow and Ayrshire are but 30 or 40 miles apart.
They're worlds apart.
And of course, often vote in the same political direction.
Yeah.
And vote left of centre. That doesn't mean they're the same place, does it?
No, not at all. Glasgow politics is unique to Glasgow.
And so by the time of the 1992 election, you were playing quite an instrumental role in the SNP's campaign.
Well, you'd promoted me to be in charge of the party's publicity. Whether you regret that or not, I don't know.
Well, it's a difficult decision, of course. but it was a very interesting campaign, because it was a campaign in 1992 which promised much.
Yeah.
It delivered much less than it promised, although it's the only campaign I've ever been able to find in history where a political party managed to put on 50%
Just about
to its
to say
vote,
that. Absolutely,
but lost a seat.
Exactly, absolutely. To be fair, one of the seats we lost was Dick Douglas's seat, who of course hadn't stood or won an election as an SNP MP, but obviously we lost Govan, which was a big loss psychologically. And the success of the election in increasing a share of the vote from the previous 14% to about 22%, that of course was lost in the media. But that formed the basis and the platform for building up, as you know, the party organisation. And by the time we moved into the late 90s, we were in a much stronger position. Now, looking back, I certainly wouldn't have maybe used the phrase that I did in the way I did and when I did about free by 93. Everybody took that as a forecast.
The authorship of the free by 93, as it turned out, an infelicitous phrase, was actually one Alex Neill, not Alex Salmond.
Yes, absolutely. And the context of that was an answer to a question about the single market, the single European market. Because my view as an economist was that if Scotland didn't get a parliament, at the very least, that was very strong and free to follow its own economic policy, then going into the single market without those tools at our disposal would present real challenges to the Scottish economy.
So we roll on to the 1999 elections, where the SNP mounted its first probably substantial electoral challenge to the Labour Party in a general election, in this case a Scottish general election in 1999. And you arrive in the Scottish Parliament as a list member for the Central Scotland. What was it like to arrive as one of that group of, I think, about 37 SNP MPs?
Well, it was 35, but it was fantastic because this was the first ever democratically elected Scottish Parliament, and to be a member of it, I think, is something that, well, you were only one of 129, so it was a very unique club to be in. And of course, I've now served nearly 18 years in the Scottish Parliament. And
so you're one of the original members of the Scottish Parliament, and
yeah.
Continuous membership from its, well, let's use the Winnie Ewing phrase, since its reconvening.
Yes.
In 1999, and you've served continuously to this point.
That's right.
But that was a marvellous time. How confident were you that things would progress to the stage where the SNP were in government?
I don't think at that stage we were hopeful, and we were certainly working for that, but I don't think anyone would have said they were absolutely sure it was going to make the kind of progress we did. And particularly the idea of being able to have an independent referendum organised effectively by the Scottish Parliament by 2014, I don't think anybody would have confidently predicted that would happen. Having said that, it became very clear, I think, early on, that as far as the people were concerned, their focus changed from being at Westminster to the Scottish Parliament.
The Scottish Parliament, adjourned on the 25th day of March in the year 1707, is hereby reconvened.
Welcome back. I'm speaking to Alex Neill about his career in Scottish politics. We'd reached a point where he arrives in the Scottish Parliament, reconvened after 300 years in 1999. The SNP won the 2011 elections by a majority in a PR system.
Yeah.
Now, were you surprised that that was possible? Straight question.
No, the answer is I wasn't, because I tried to keep my
You might have told me before.
No, I tried to keep my ear very close to the ground, as you know, and the feedback from the grassroots, and by that I don't just mean SNP supporters, but from people who were traditional Labour voters, I thought it was possible. I wouldn't have predicted it, because I think that it was a tall order in a PR system. But I have to say, by about 3 weeks before polling day, I was convinced that we could, not necessarily would, but that we could actually make the magic number to become a majority government. And of course it happened. I didn't tell you, I didn't tell anyone else that that was my feeling, because I didn't want to set expectations running. But my view right along in that campaign was that we could do it, and we did it.
In the run-up to the Scottish referendum of 2014, in retrospect, with the benefit of hindsight, how well was that played, or were there mistakes that we can, the SNP can learn from in the future?
Well, you can always learn from mistakes, but that's not, you know, I think we ran an exceptionally good campaign. I think we went from, you know, below 30 in terms of support for independence, and by polling day we had that up to 45%. And that was against almost the entire media, both the written media and a lot of the television media and others being against us. Clearly, the big boys all come up from London in the last week to try and promise the vow, so-called vow, that they were going to deliver big powers if we voted against independence, which had an influence in the campaign.
And you think that was influential? Because many commentators say it wasn't.
No, where it was influential was the fact that it was effectively delivered by Gordon Brown. And no matter what the SNP thinks of Gordon Brown, he does have influence still, or did at that time, with Labour voters, or enough Labour voters in Scotland.
Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister, by then in retirement, came out of retirement to back a no vote in the referendum and to underpin this new commitment to Scotland for what's sometimes called devil max. That's lots of powers, but short of independence.
And I think what he did was he swung maybe 3 or 4% Labour voters, but they were equivalent to 3 or 4% of the electorate, maybe 5% at the most. But that was enough for us to turn the tide in the or for them to turn the tide in the last week. Otherwise, I think we might have done it.
So the aftermath of the 2014, I stepped down as First Minister. I resign. I leave the field clear for Nicola Sturgeon, and there's the most enormous success in the 2015 general election, where the momentum from the referendum carries forward and sweeps the Unionist parties aside, winning 56 out of 59 Scottish seats. Did you ever think that was possible?
I don't think anybody thought that was possible, including the Unionist parties. And the other thing is, so I think we all made the mistake, us and the Unionist parties, of thinking that that was Scottish politics set for the next 20 years, that, you know, these, particularly the Labour Party, couldn't make any of a comeback, and that we were going to be at that level. And I think, looking back, you know, that was too presumptuous, because obviously in the subsequent general election we lost 20 of those seats. So I think that was a salutary lesson for us.
But then something's happened. I mean, we'd muted the point during the referendum that it was possible that Scotland could be taken out of Europe against its will.
Yes.
We put the point forward, where of course the No campaign said that was impossible. The only way to stay within Europe was to vote no in the referendum. But lo and behold, David Cameron, as Prime Minister, gambled everything in the European referendum and lost. So the situation that we'd ventilated as being a classic illustration of Scotland's inability to control its own destiny, as other great examples, the Trident submarines or the war in Iraq, came to pass. in 2016. Were you surprised that that did not cause a sea change of opinion towards independence, given that the indications are that independence support has stayed roughly where it was in 2014, much, much higher than previously, but not surging beyond the 50% mark?
I wasn't surprised. In fact, at a political cabinet just after Nicola had taken over, where we were discussing the prospect of this possibly happening. Nobody wanted it to happen particularly because clearly the SNP didn't want to come out of Europe. But at that discussion, I specifically made the point that I did not believe that if we ended up with a differential vote between Scotland and the rest of the UK, that that would automatically lead to a stampede for independence or anything like it.
But in particular, your emotional attachment may be less than the SNP's, and there have been suggestions that you personally voted no in the European referendum. Now's the opportunity to clear that up one way or other for all time.
I've been honest about it. I voted no. I didn't campaign in the referendum because I just left the government and I thought it wasn't right so quickly to go against government policy, because it would have been, no doubt seen as a tactical move rather than an issue of principle.
The issue which you put your finger on many, many years ago in the run-up to the 1992 election, and then a UK government analysis, the one that wasn't meant to be there, leaked a week or two back, showing that the UK government's own Brexit-driven analysis is being out the single market in economic terms is hugely damaging. Maybe not the Armageddon that George Osborne was committing himself to, but nonetheless a substantial chunk of GDP analysis by a Brexit department within a Brexit government. In these circumstances, why aren't you in the same position as you were back in 1992, accepting the preeminence of the single market in terms of the health of the Scottish economy?
Well, two things. First of all, I've never seen any government economic forecast in 50 years that was anywhere near accurate. I mean, if you look at recently...
There's a lot of averages. They're bound to get one right.
Well, they haven't so far. The National Office of Statistics has produced an analysis recently, not of a forecast, but the growth rate for last year. And they got it so badly out. They were forecasting less than 1.5% growth for the UK, and it turns out it was 2% growth. So they can't tell us what's just happened, let alone forecast what's going to happen in 12 years' time.
So you think the anti-Brexit Scottish government, who are forecasting a major economic impact from being out of the single market, and the pro-Brexit UK government, who are also forecasting a substantial impact, you think they're both wrong, coming from different opinions?
Well, it's not coming from different opinions, because it's very clear that the UK forecast is coming from civil servants who are wanting us to stay in the European Union and the Scottish Government. Obviously, that's their policy. But the important thing is, where do we... And let me just say, one of the big faults of these forecasts is they don't take account of the behavioural changes that will happen, particularly in the business community, if and when Brexit actually happens or doesn't happen. Because business adapts. And there is nothing in these forecasts to analyse how business will adapt. But the history of our economy, going back hundreds of years, is whether it's wars, whether it's revolutions, whatever it is, business adapts.
And we don't have to go back hundreds of years. We only have to go back 25 years since Alex Neill was telling the Scottish National Party we must get to independence because of this huge importance of the single marketplace. Why does Alex Neill, quarter of a century later, having got there before the rest of opinion, now seem to disregard this membership of the single market as such an important economic...
Well, the first thing is the EU has changed dramatically in that intervening period.
But let me talk about the single market.
Well, the single market and the EU have changed dramatically in that period of time. But more importantly, looking to the future, and this is where you and I think, will agree, in terms of Scotland and an independent Scotland, I think, in fact, actually, George Osborne recently has made a statement saying that the UK should do this as well. But I think the best way forward for Scotland, which avoids the downsides of Brexit, now I admit, it's a balance, but also allows us to keep our access to, and its access to the single market is important, is to adopt what's called the Norwegian solution, to join EFTA, the European Free Trade Association. Now that means that we're not going to be tied into a federal United States of Europe, which I think is going to happen and would certainly not leave Scotland independent, whereas if we adopt something like the EFTA Norway type solution, then we'd be in a much stronger position all round.
So let's employ your 50 years experience in politics, having started at a very young age.
Yeah.
What's going to happen now? What's going to happen at Westminster?
Yeah.
What's going to happen to Scotland?
Well, like economic forecasters, I'm always cautious in terms of forecasting what will happen, but I think...
Will we be free by 2023?
Well, I think there's a good chance that we will be, if not entirely independent, certainly much more independent than we are at the present time. I think in the short term, a number of things are obvious. Number one is I think Theresa May might survive just to see the Brexit deal done in October of this year, but then she's a goner. So there will be a change of leadership in the Tory party. That's bound to have consequences which could be good or bad for the Tory party. And, you know, I think any Tory government is bad for the country anyway. But there's the possibility that we'll have another general election either in 2019 or 2020, particularly if I'm right and there's a new leader. And that will have consequences. Secondly, I think the Brexit deal will be done. I mean, I just, no matter which way you look at it, no matter how optimistic or pessimistic you are, it's in the interest of the EU as well as the UK to have a deal. And I think a deal will be done. And we need to see the shape of that deal before we can then forecast what's likely to happen thereafter. But I think some things are very clear. May's going to go at some point fairly soon. Brexit, I think we will end up with a deal, including a transition period. And after that, we've got to try and shape our own future and not allow anyone, whether you're pro-Brexit or anti-Brexit or whatever, we shouldn't be allowing other people to decide the future of Scotland. I don't want it decided in Brussels, don't want it decided in London. I want it decided by the people in Scotland.
Alex, Neill, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Now, this has been a very revealing show, not least for me personally. For much of the last generation, I've had a number of political differences with Alex Neill. Of course, we've cooperated on many occasions for Scotland's benefit, and indeed I have appointed him to the highest ministerial offices in the land, but we've seldom been in total political agreement. Now, however, it's difficult to argue with his contention that a definitive way forward for Scotland is beckoning in membership of EFTA, the European Free Trade Association, an organisation which would allow our country to retain its European economic and social connections without the danger of being absorbed into the perspective of a federal continent. In a sea of political uncertainty, it might well unite the country and be the key to Scotland's further constitutional progress. From Taz and me and all of the team at the Alex Salmond Show, goodbye for now.